Steve had been exploring this uncharted jungle planet for hours when he realized he was hopelessly lost. The dense foliage closed in around him like a labyrinth, and the oppressive heat wasn't helping his focus. He'd planned on a short trek, but somehow, he'd wandered too far off course. His wrist communicator had malfunctioned long ago, and he couldn't remember the last time he'd seen another sign of life. His frustration was palpable, and the more he walked, the more hopeless he felt. But just when he thought it couldn't get any worse, he stumbled upon something truly bizarre, a massive clearing, with massive trees hanging with bright, tempting fruits. At the center stood a towering structure that looked like an ancient temple, albeit one adorned with strange, erotic symbols. It seemed out of place here, like it had been built by something far more intelligent, and definitely more sexual in nature, than anything he'd ever encountered. Steve, ever the adventurer, couldn't resist investigating. He approached cautiously, stepping past bushes and branches, squinting against the strange, glowing light in the clearing. And then, out of nowhere, a group of women appeared, tall, statuesque, with glowing eyes, and skin that seemed to shimmer in the alien sunlight. They were impossibly beautiful, their figures towering over Steve's 5'9" frame. He froze. One of them, the leader by the looks of it, stepped forward. She was even taller than the rest, easily 8 feet. Her hair was long and golden, braided in a way that screamed royalty. She smiled, her full lips parting as she addressed him in a slow, deliberate tone. "You are trespassing," she said. Steve could tell by the inflection that this was not a suggestion. He cleared his throat. Look, I'm sorry, I didn't mean any harm. Just got a little lost." His hands were up in a placating gesture, though he wasn't sure it would do much against a group of women who could snap him in half with one hand. The leader didn't seem amused. "You must partake in the sacred feast," she announced, her voice as commanding as her stature. Steve blinked. "Feast? Or face the consequences?" He cocked an eyebrow. "What kind of feast?" Her eyes glinted dangerously. "You will eat from the pussy-vine pear, and prove your worth to our tribe." Steve blinked again. He could feel a nervous laugh bubbling up, but he choked it back. What the hell was a pussy-vine pear? The tribe, looking more like Amazonian warriors than anything else, had him surrounded now, and their eyes were unblinking. "The what?" Steve said, trying to sound casual as though this was any regular planetary custom. The woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. "The pussy-vine pear," she repeated, slowly and deliberately, as though he had just insulted the very foundation of their civilization. "You will eat it. Or—" She let the threat hang in the air, making it clear there were no other options. "Well, I'm not exactly sure I'm hungry," Steve said, taking a cautious step back. "Look, maybe we can work something out. I mean, I'm not really from around here." The leader's face hardened. "You will eat, or we will feed you to the predator prowler." "Okay." Now Steve's heart rate kicked up. He had heard the stories about the predator prowler. A savage beast that roamed these parts, ferocious, untamable. No one survived an encounter with it. He'd heard the whispers from the locals when he first landed, and he wasn't about to be its next meal. "Whoa, hold on a second!" Steve raised his hands again. "That's a little extreme, don't you think? I mean, I'm just a guy trying to get back home." The leader's eyes narrowed, and with a sudden swiftness, she thrust a large, oddly shaped fruit into his hands. Its skin was a peculiar shade of purple, and it almost hummed with energy, as though it was alive. The air around it seemed to pulse with a strange, intoxicating aroma. He couldn't help but breathe it in deeply, then quickly regretted it. There was something oddly seductive about it. "Eat it," she demanded. Steve hesitated. "I'm really not into whatever this is. I've got, dietary restrictions." The leader stepped closer, towering over him, her breath hot against his neck. "You will eat it," she said again, her tone low and commanding, sending a strange shiver through his body. Her hands were now dangerously close to his chest. He could feel his heart racing, but not from fear anymore. Something about this whole situation had shifted. The air had gotten warmer, thicker. Steve's breath quickened. As she pressed the fruit into his hand again, she smirked. It's not just food, Earthling. It is a blessing. Something about her eyes was hypnotic, and before he could protest further, Steve found his mouth opening of its own accord. The fruit was just there, and before he could fully process it, he bit into the skin. At first, nothing happened. The fruit tasted sweet, almost like an exotic tropical fruit, and Steve couldn't help but feel a strange rush of warmth spread through his chest. But then, a sudden jolt shot through him, something like a chemical rush, like he was drowning in pure desire. His cheeks flushed. His head spun. The world around him became a blur of golden light, the women around him growing even more stunning by the second. Their gazes were no longer menacing but instead full of curious intrigue. He swore he could feel his heart beat faster, harder, as though the blood in his veins had shifted from fear to something else entirely. This wasn't just a fruit. This was an aphrodisiac. A powerful one. He opened his mouth to protest, but all that came out was an unintelligible mumble as his body betrayed him, reacting instinctively to their presence. And then, it all hit him at once. The realization. The threat. He had been tricked into eating an aphrodisiac. The goddess and her tribe were not just powerful, they were seductive, and they were expecting him to react. Steve couldn't help but laugh nervously, the irony of the situation hitting him like a ton of bricks. How had he gotten into this mess? How had he gone from a simple lost tourist to some strange alien love feast? And as the leader's sultry gaze locked onto his, he knew that the real feast wasn't just the fruit, he was the main course. Steve's mind was spinning, but in the most embarrassing way. His body was responding in ways he couldn't control, like some foreign force had hijacked his senses. The women around him seemed to take notice almost immediately, their eyes widening as they took in his flushed face and the awkward shift in his posture. He glanced at the fruit in his hand, as if to confirm his suspicions. It was still the same, purple, plump, and seductive, but now it seemed to mock him. What kind of strange alien custom was this? He had bitten into it expecting something harmless, and now he felt like his entire body was being overtaken by an uncontrollable wave of desire. The leader, still towering over him, took a slow step forward. "You have partaken in the feast," she said, her voice low and almost sultry. "Now you must prove yourself worthy of us." Steve, trying to keep his composure, forced himself to take a deep breath. "Worthy of what exactly? I mean, look, I didn't sign up for any of this. Feast business." She raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by his discomfort. "You have no choice. Our customs demand it." At this point, Steve couldn't even deny that he was beginning to feel an undeniable attraction to her. Her presence was so overwhelming, it was like he was being drawn to her magnetically. He knew this wasn't him. This was the damn fruit messing with his head. It was like someone had flipped a switch in his brain, and now he was a walking ball of lust. "No," he managed to say, fighting the growing heat in his chest. "This isn't happening. I can't be your feast." The leader stepped even closer, and her scent hit him like a wave, intoxicating and heavy. He staggered slightly, his body betraying him again, and for a moment, he was unsure whether he wanted to run or give in. The other women were watching with expressions of pure anticipation, their eyes gleaming like they were waiting for a show. "It has already happened," she said, her voice dropping lower. "The fruit binds you to us now. And there is no turning back." Steve felt his heart skip a beat. What the hell was this fruit? It wasn't just some sweet, delicious snack, it had done something to him, something powerful. As if on cue, the leader's hands slowly reached out to touch his shoulder, and the sensation of her fingers on his skin sent a jolt through him. He couldn't help the low gasp that escaped his lips, his body tensing involuntarily. "Now you will perform the sacred ritual," she declared. "Ritual?" Steve repeated, his voice sounding almost strangled. His mind was a chaotic mess. "What are you talking about?" Without warning, she grabbed his hand, pressing his palm against the warm curve of her body. It was like an electric shock. his breath caught in his throat. His instincts screamed at him to break free, to run, to fight, anything but let this continue, but the fruit had rendered him helpless. He couldn't look away, and every inch of his body screamed in overwhelming lust. The other women, sensing his hesitation, stepped forward, encircling him like some kind of sensual jungle predator, their gazes locked on his every move. His breathing was shallow, and the heat from his body radiated outward, mixing with the thick, musky air around them. He realized he was starting to lose himself in the moment, unable to tell what was real anymore. He tried to focus. This couldn't be real. He wasn't some plaything for these giant women, no matter how appealing they were. He had to think. He couldn't let himself fall into this insane situation. He cleared his throat, forcing the words out. I can't do this. I'm not, whatever this is. The leader smiled knowingly, as if she had been expecting this very resistance. The fruit has already chosen, she said softly. You are ours now. The only question is whether you will resist or surrender. Steve felt a surge of panic. This wasn't how he was supposed to go out. Trapped on an alien planet, drugged by an aphrodisiac fruit, surrounded by a tribe of incredibly hot alien women. The situation was absurd, and he could feel his dignity slipping away with every second he stayed there. No, he said again, shaking his head. I'm not doing this. The women around him, however, didn't seem to be in any mood to take no for an answer. The leader stepped back, letting out a soft chuckle. You think you can refuse us? She asked, her voice low and teasing. Steve didn't know how to respond to that. His heart was still racing, and his pulse thudded loudly in his ears. This was insanity. He was being hunted by a group of beautiful alien women who wanted him to eat a fruit that had altered his body chemistry, and now was attempting to make him their willing participant in some ritual. But then, a thought struck him like a lightning bolt. If he could find a way to get a grip on himself, he might still be able to turn this around. He had to focus, to snap out of the haze the fruit had put him in. There had to be a way to outsmart these women. After all, this was a game of survival now. Escape was his only option. He had to use his wits, not his body, to get out of this situation. I just need a minute, he said, voice tight. A minute to think. The leader tilted her head, clearly not fully trusting his words, but she stepped back slightly, allowing him some space. The other women seemed to be having a silent conversation among themselves, exchanging glances that only heightened Steve's anxiety. He had to act fast before the fruit completely took over his senses. I don't belong here, Steve continued, gathering his thoughts. This is not my fight. You're not going to get what you want from me. The leader's gaze sharpened, but Steve didn't wait for her to respond. He moved quickly, trying to ignore the heat coursing through him. He needed to get away from them, and fast. The women started closing in again, but this time Steve was ready. He sprinted, pushing through the crowd of them, doing everything he could to ignore the pull of their presence. He had to get away, somewhere far from the ritual, far from the fruit, far from them. His heart pounded as he ran, but even as he broke through the line of women, he couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how hard he tried, this wasn't over. The fruit had already changed everything. Now, he wasn't just running for his life, he was running for his dignity. Steve ran, his legs burning with exertion as he pushed his body to the limit, trying to distance himself from the seductive chaos of the tribe. The pulsating heat of the fruit still lingered in his bloodstream, and his mind was in a fog, struggling to process reality. The dense jungle planet around him felt surreal, its vibrant colors and strange sounds blurring together as he sprinted, not daring to look back. He couldn't help but laugh bitterly to himself as he stumbled through the foliage. How had he gotten into this mess? A tourist on an uncharted planet, exploring what was supposed to be an adventure, now running for his life from a group of towering, beautiful alien women who were determined to make him their feast. This was madness. He needed a plan. No, scratch that, he needed a way out. Fast. A rustle of movement behind him sent a surge of panic through his chest, but he didn't dare slow down. His lungs were on fire, and his heart was thumping against his ribcage as he weaved through the trees. A quick glance over his shoulder confirmed his worst fear. They were still following him. Of course they were. The women weren't just tall and intimidating, they were fast. Every step seemed to bring them closer, their towering forms cutting through the underbrush with ease. Steve gritted his teeth and pushed himself harder, but the creeping feeling of dread wouldn't let go. These women weren't about to let him escape that easily. He needed to think. There had to be a way out. And then it hit him, he had the perfect distraction. The fruit. The reason everything had gone sideways in the first place. If he could somehow get rid of the fruit, maybe he could clear his head and come up with a way to escape or, at the very least, regain control over his situation. His mind raced as he glanced around for a way to dispose of the fruit. The jungle, though lush and dense, was oddly devoid of anything he could use. He was stuck with the fruit in his hand, and even the idea of throwing it away made him feel a strange sense of loss. Could he really just discard the very thing that had his body so stirred? Another crash through the trees behind him made the decision for him. He gritted his teeth and threw the fruit as far as he could into the thicket. The sweet, sticky flesh splattered on the ground with an unpleasant squelch, and Steve, feeling like a man who had just made the biggest mistake of his life, continued running. But no sooner had the fruit left his hand than the sensation in his body shifted. The rush of heat that had once consumed him started to ebb. His senses cleared, and for the first time since biting into the cursed fruit, he felt like he had control over his own body again. A wave of relief washed over him. He was free. Or at least, he would be once he got far enough away from the tribe. But just as he began to slow down, hoping he might have finally shaken them, a voice echoed from behind him. "You think you can run forever?" It was the leader's voice. The one who had been so insistent on making him partake in their absurd ritual. Steve's heart dropped. Of course they were still behind him. How could he forget the kind of predator they were? He had to face the facts, he couldn't outrun them. His only chance now was to confront the situation head-on. He skidded to a stop, turned to face the oncoming women, and braced himself for the inevitable. The leader, followed by the other women, approached him with a steady, almost predatory pace. Their eyes gleamed, as if they were savoring the moment of victory. But there was something different in their expressions now, something softer, almost like curiosity. Were they no longer as intent on devouring him? Steve's heart was still racing, but now, it wasn't from the panic of being hunted. It was from the sheer absurdity of it all. He didn't know what they were playing at, but there was one thing he knew for sure: if he didn't make his stand now, he would be caught in this madness forever. "I'm not playing your game," he said, his voice a bit more steady than he expected. "This whole thing has gone too far. You want me to prove myself or whatever, but I'm not some prize for you to claim." The leader tilted her head, studying him. Her towering form was imposing, but now that his senses were no longer clouded, Steve could see the depth of her gaze. "You misunderstand," she said, her voice calm but still filled with authority. "We do not claim you. We seek understanding. And you," she paused, a smirk playing on her lips, "are the first human to make it this far." Steve blinked, confused. "Make it this far? What are you talking about?" The leader's smile deepened. "You have resisted the fruit, resisted our customs. No human has ever done that. And yet you still stand before us, defiant and unwilling. That to us is impressive." The women around her murmured in agreement. Steve's mind scrambled to catch up. Was this it? Was the entire thing just some bizarre test? It was hard to believe, but with everything he'd been through, he wasn't ruling anything out. "Wait," he said, his voice tentative. "So this whole ritual thing? Was it all just some kind of test?" The leader nodded, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "Precisely. We seek to find those who can withstand the trials of our people. Those who would be worthy partners, should they choose to join us." Steve couldn't believe what he was hearing. This wasn't about the fruit or some strange feast, it was about proving his worth. And now that he had passed their test, they were considering him a partner? This was definitely not what he'd signed up for when he landed on this planet. But here he was, facing a tribe of giant alien women who saw him as some kind of prize. It was too much. "I'm flattered," Steve said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But I think I'll pass on the honor of being your partner." The leader's expression softened, as if she understood the difficulty of the situation. "It is a choice," she said simply. "But now you know what we seek. And you are free to leave, if you wish." Steve stared at her, still processing the strange turn of events. Part of him wanted to escape and never look back, but another part was intrigued. Was this really over? Were they going to let him go without any more of their weird tests or rituals? He took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had survived this long. Maybe it was time to call it a win. Without another word, he turned, ready to leave the tribe behind him. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he might just be walking into the next absurd adventure. Steve's mind raced as he walked away, but something gnawed at the back of his thoughts. The absurdity of it all, the bizarre customs, the wild, over-the-top chase, it was a lot to process. Despite the bizarre and chaotic nature of his ordeal, a strange sense of respect had begun to form in him for these women. They were nothing if not dedicated to their traditions, even if those traditions were, well, totally off the charts. He shook his head, trying to clear the mental fog still clinging to him from the fruit. It was almost laughable how quickly everything escalated, from the moment he landed on this uncharted planet, lost in the jungle, to finding himself in a bizarre standoff with an entire tribe of towering, beautiful alien women. If someone had told him about this adventure before he'd embarked on it, he would have laughed it off as pure fiction. Now, he was left with an odd mixture of bewilderment and relief. The jungle stretched endlessly before him, the thick foliage closing in behind him as he walked. His legs were sore, and his stomach growled in protest, but he couldn't bring himself to care. He had just narrowly avoided becoming the centerpiece of a savage ritual, and the idea of sitting down for a normal meal, in a place that didn't involve strange aphrodisiac fruits and larger-than-life alien women, sounded heavenly. But just as the tension of the moment began to fade, he heard something, a sound cutting through the air that sent a cold shiver down his spine. It wasn't the growl of the predator-prowler, thank God, but the unmistakable rustling of movement behind him. He froze in his tracks, every muscle in his body locking up as he turned around, dreading what he would see. There they were. The Velusian goddesses, standing tall and formidable as ever, each one looking a little too pleased with themselves. At the forefront was the leader, her eyes gleaming with that same amused yet challenging look she had worn earlier. "Did you think you could just walk away?" she asked, her voice smooth, almost teasing. Steve's heart skipped a beat, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I thought I made it pretty clear I wasn't interested," he replied, hoping his voice didn't betray the anxious tension building in his chest. The leader stepped closer, her height towering over him, casting a shadow that felt like an overwhelming force. "We understand," she said. "But you have not yet experienced what we truly offer. You resisted our customs, true. But that only makes you unique." Her words had a weight to them, one that made Steve's mind swirl. Unique? Was this some kind of diplomatic mission now? Were they planning to recruit him for some larger cosmic test, to prove his worthiness to whatever intergalactic council these women answered to? He tried to laugh it off, but the more he thought about it, the more ridiculous it seemed. "I'm just a tourist," he said quickly, taking a cautious step back. "I'm not looking for anything more than a way off this planet." The leader smiled, the kind of smile that made Steve question whether he was in danger of being swallowed up or flattered. "We can help you," she said. "But you must understand, there are consequences for not fully embracing our ways." Steve felt a lump form in his throat. The stakes seemed higher than ever, but his mind was still reeling from the entire absurd situation. Was he seriously going to be part of their world now, or was this some kind of elaborate ruse? "No more tests, no more fruit," he said, trying to assert himself. "I just want to go home." The leader's gaze softened for a moment. You have already made an impression on us, Steve. And that, in itself, is a rare thing. You resisted our customs, but you didn't shy away from the challenges we presented. Most would have given in by now. Steve blinked, unsure of how to react. Was this supposed to be some kind of honor? Were they praising him? He didn't know what kind of insane cultural ritual this was, but he sure as hell didn't want to stick around to figure it out. Before he could say anything else, the leader continued. You have a choice now. Leave, and we'll make sure you are safely returned to your ship. Or stay, and see what else we have to offer. Her words hung in the air, thick with an unspoken promise. The look in her eyes made it clear she wasn't giving up on him yet. Steve felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The offer was tempting. He could just walk away and leave all of this madness behind. Or he could stay, and who knew what kind of insane adventure awaited him next? I'm not staying for some weird cosmic ritual, Steve said, his voice firm, but his legs still felt like jelly. I came here to explore, not to get roped into some intergalactic dating game. The leader's eyes twinkled with a knowing smile. Perhaps you will reconsider after you've experienced all we have to offer, she said, her voice softer now, almost coaxing. There was something in her tone that made Steve hesitate. Was she serious? The thought of just giving in, of experiencing more of their odd customs, no matter how absurd, was undeniably intriguing. But he couldn't shake the sense that it was all a trap, one designed to bind him in some sort of cosmic bargain he didn't want any part of. He let out a frustrated breath, wiping the sweat from his forehead. I'm not interested, he said again, this time more forcefully. I've had enough of this crazy planet. I just want to go home. For a moment, the leader didn't respond. She simply looked at him, sizing him up. Then, as if deciding something, she nodded, a smile breaking across her face. Very well, she said. You are free to leave, Steve. But know this, if you ever change your mind, we will be here. With that, the women turned and began to move away, their towering figures retreating into the jungle. Steve's legs almost gave out from the mixture of relief and exhaustion as he stood there, processing everything that had just transpired. As the last of the women disappeared into the trees, Steve took a deep breath and looked around. It was over. He had survived. He had resisted the strange customs, avoided the absurd rituals, and had somehow managed to make it out in one piece. But even as he began walking back to where he had landed his ship, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Some part of him wondered if, just maybe, there was a lot more to this planet, and its people, than he'd ever imagined. And deep down, he knew that his adventure was far from over.